recent studies, which are, I think, really cool. They give basically a sham breakfast to people, a placebo breakfast. So they give modified gels. It's at least a semi-solid meal with taste and texture and everything. And you don't know when you're eating that if it's just flavors that you're consuming or if it actually has calories. Such a breakfast increases performance similarly to an actual breakfast with carbohydrates. Whereas people that don't eat anything, they do have worse performance. So there might also be an effect of satiety, because in those studies they do find that, or at least in one of them they measured it, that hunger levels decreased. And if you're hungry, your willpower levels might be lower. It might be harder to push yourself for those last reps. I would say it is important to eat protein before your workouts, because there are at least 2 studies that show, again, eating something compared to nothing improves performance, but protein is just as effective as carbohydrates. In isocaloric settings, so when you're equating for energy content, the effects disappear almost completely. In fact, this is an extremely striking finding. I find in our systematic review, we did not find a single isocaloric study in which higher carbohydrate intakes resulted in significantly higher strength training performance compared to a lower carbohydrate intake. None, not a single one. I mean, if you look at how ardently most people believe that carbohydrates do improve performance. I mean, there are some indication, but it's mostly during, like I said, fasting. There's strong possibility of a psychological effect, etc. It's definitely a dogma, the importance of high carbohydrate intakes. If you look purely at the data, there's simply very little to substantiate those beliefs. In almost any scenario, training hard is better and training close to failure and with relatively heavy weights, because you can basically always just reduce the volume. If you don't want to get much bigger, you could, of course, not train heavy and then do 5 sets of squats, but you could also do 1 hard set and you'll get the same result effectively. Excess muscle growth is a luxury problem that they don't actually have to deal with. A lot of people think they might have to deal with it. Especially women are often brainwashed into thinking, oh, you go to the gym, the next morning you wake up as the She-Hulk. Yeah, not so much. It's actually very hard to build a very muscular physique. Most people also find that when they see these things happening in their body, they actually like them, because a lot of people have this idea of being more toned, for example. The toned is a very common word, which actually means, if you translate it to physical terms, simply more muscle growth and more fat loss. So you want to lose a bit of fat, you want to gain a bit of muscle. And that's exactly the essence of bodybuilding. So most people that want to get toned actually should do a bodybuilding program, because they have the exact same goals, just to a different mile. They can stop earlier, or they can reduce the volume at some point when they're happy with how they look. Maybe they train twice or 3 times a week instead of every day. It is very quickly worthwhile, also for health and longevity, to do at least 1 or 2 strength training workouts per week. And there's actually research showing that if time is limited, for most goals, including health, strength training is and fat loss, interestingly, strength training is the more efficient route. Because with cardio, essentially what you're doing is every workout that you do is a one-time investment into your body, and especially into energy expenditure. So you get some health benefits. But with strength training, you're building your body. You're literally increasing your body size. And what that does is it increases your metabolic rate and the amount of extra muscle mass. It also improves insulin sensitivity, which decreases chronic inflammation levels. So if you get more muscular and leaner, that's an investment, especially increased muscle size, that keeps paying off. So for fat loss, there are also a few other advantages of strength training, but most important thing is that you're literally investing in your long-term energy expenditure that's going to pay off for the rest of your life. We can at least say that almost everyone that trains up to 3 times a week should do full body strength training workouts. Don't bother with body part split or typical bodybuilding style workouts. They're not more effective in any sense. And it's in particular much more time effective to do full body training, because you can use your rest intervals to train other muscle groups. So for example, you can do a set of leg curls, a set of squats, a set of pull downs, a set of bench presses, all with just 1 minute rest in between or something. Or as I call it, a combo set. If you do rest in between exercises, but not a full 5 minutes, then you save so much time, rather than if you do, 1 set of bench press, 3 minutes rest, 1 set of bench press, 3 minutes rest, then you have done 3 sets in about 10 minutes. And in those 10 minutes, you could probably also do 2 sets of like 5 different exercises. So then you've done 10 sets instead of 3 sets. Stresses that you impose on the body that result in certain adaptations along a continuum from endurance to strength.
Okay.
And broadly speaking, you can categorize any kind of physical exercise somewhere on that spectrum. Of course, cardio and strength training fall on basically polar opposite ends of that spectrum. Even if you're doing high intensity interval training, like sprinting, many people have the idea that it's, very close to strength training. It's absolutely not. If you want to train like a sprinter, then you should train like an actual sprinter, which means you're sprinting for like 10 seconds and then you're resting for 5 minutes. Most people think of Tabata protocols, like 20-second sprinting and then 10-second rest, as training like a sprinter. But Olympic sprinters, short distance sprinters, because the long distance sprinters don't really have the physiques that most people aspire to, is a very different ballpark. So you can actually see this in individuals. If they do endurance training, you stimulate more AMPK signaling, and it's more metabolic. There's more substrate depletion. So the adaptations that occur are things like mitochondrial protein synthesis, sarcoplasmic protein synthesis, increases in lung capacity, heart capacity. And if you do strength training, the focus is a lot more on muscle hypertrophy. The muscle gets bigger. There's an increase in strength. There are adaptations in the nervous system that increase the amount of force the body or the muscles can produce, even relative to their size. So these adaptations, when you try to put both of the body, you have both of these stresses on the body at the same time, the body essentially has to prioritize. It cannot do both at the same time. So a very crude analogy is that you can think of it as a garden hose. And with endurance training, you're basically telling it, you need to be more conservative with energy. You need a very long, sustained, slow output of water. And with strength training, you're saying, okay, we need to output as much water as we possibly can. So we need a big hose. And, in the body, it's a lot more subtle, of course. There seems to be interference between mTOR and AMPK signaling, for example, which are anabolic pathways that result in different types of protein synthesis. So essentially, if you're doing both at the same time, especially in close proximity to one another, then the body has to choose which kind of adaptations it wants, and that results in a compromise on both accounts, typically. So you won't gain as much muscle, you won't gain as much strength. Sometimes you also won't gain as much endurance, although usually if you do both at the same time, the focus shifts towards endurance, because if you think about it, if you do a strength training workout and then a cardio session afterwards, then essentially it's like one very long endurance session, because there's a lot of substrate depletion and fatigue from the strength training. And then with the cardio session, that adds on top of that. You also don't have to worry about things like walking to the gym or just going for a short hike, taking the bicycle somewhere. Those things aren't a problem because they don't result in significant endurance adaptations. So they also won't initiate all the signaling pathways that can negatively interact with the anabolic signaling pathways from strength training. Okay. So it's really for endurance training. Even mild cardio is not necessarily a problem, but on the other hand, it's also not really needed. Like there's nothing cardio does that you cannot also do with strength training, unless you're specifically interested in endurance training. Because of course, if you want to run a marathon, you need to run. You can't just go to the gym and squat.